I had a very interesting experience this past week that I want to share with you this morning. I was invited to attend a dinner party that was being given in honor of a Presbyterian minister from out of town who was here for some special purpose. Though exactly what that purpose was, I never did find out. Everyone else who was there, and it was quite a lineup of folks in leadership roles both in our presbytery and in the larger denomination, all of them seemed to have known this person for years, and they all pretty obviously knew what she was doing here in town. So I figured the better part of valor was simply to act like I knew who she was too. I wonder who she was, actually. I have no recollection of ever having met this particular person or even heard of her, though that is not all that surprising since I don't often move in the circles of the movers and shakers in the PCUSA. And it was quite a group gathered at the table that night. In addition to the guest of honor, there were two members of the presbytery staff, two former moderators of the presbytery, as well as the current moderator, two senior staff members from a denominational agency, the pastor of one of the most prominent churches in our presbytery, and last of all, clearly the odd man out, me. Now, pretty much literally, the odd man out. Since of the 10 people gathered at the table that night, I was one of only 2 men. Everyone else at the table was a woman. And I only make note of that to remind us all just how much things have changed both in the church and in the larger society. For the fact is, had I attended such a gathering in the church, say 40 years ago, at the front end of my ministry, everyone at the table would almost certainly have been men, and probably all white men at that. Every single one. How times have changed. But that raises a question that I would like for us to think about today. And that is, how do you know what someone means when they use the word we? You see, when someone says, I think, or I believe, or I know, it's perfectly clear what they mean. Just who exactly it is that they're speaking for. Themselves, and no one else. And no one would question their ability or right to do that. But when someone says, we think, or we believe, or we know, it's never quite so clear what that means. Just who it is that they're really speaking on behalf of. I don't doubt but that every one of the men at my hypothetical 40-year-ago dinner party, when speaking on behalf of the PCUSA, would have felt that they were speaking for the whole church and sincerely believed that they were doing so. But were they really? If they were just 10 white men speaking for the whole church, did they really do that? And if the folks around the table the other night where I was sitting had spoken of, in terms of the PCUSA being we, as in fact they did, who would they have meant by that? Who would their we actually have been? And how do we ever really know? Ever really know just exactly who is we? Now, there are 3 things that have prompted my thoughts along these lines this past week. The first has been our annual Constitution Seminar, which concluded yesterday, and where we have been looking at the three stages of constitution making in U.S. history. The first stage being the Declaration of Independence and its severing of ties with Great Britain in 1776. The second being the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, and then its implementation in the decades that followed. And finally, the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, in the aftermath of the most destructive war in U.S. history. An amendment that cast the entire Constitution in a new light, or would have done so if it had ever been fully implemented. Three quite distinct stages. And one way to look at each of those stages and how they differed is to look at how they used or did not use the word we, and just exactly who they meant by we. For example, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," he may well, and no doubt did, think of himself as speaking for everyone in colonial America. Indeed, for right-thinking people pretty much everywhere. But it's all too painfully obvious to us that he really didn't. I mean, how on earth does a man who owns slaves say with a straight face that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How does he say that unless he really doesn't include slaves among the we? And if he doesn't include them, then who else does he not include? And when James Madison and others later penned the preamble to the United States Constitution, famously beginning with the words, "We the people of the United States," it's less clear just exactly who that is, this "we the people," than it is what they're actually doing, which is establishing the institutions of governance. Institutions which Madison clearly hoped would then be able to paper over the inherent ambiguities that existed in that "we the people," which perhaps predictably, though tragically, did not happen. And those inherent ambiguities, most of all the continuing reality of slavery, eventually brought the whole house down in the Civil War. And it was to settle that problem once and for all that the 13th, 14th, and ultimately 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, no longer settling for another ambiguous "we," but spelling it out in terms that allowed for no such ambiguity, not "we this" or "we that," but all persons. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. All persons, not some "we," whoever that may be, which should have finally settled the matter. But unfortunately, while we may have ratified the amendment, we never really accepted it as the law of the land, certainly not in my part of the world, by which I mean, of course, Rittenhouse Square. And even today, it's still a real question. Just exactly who is this we keep talking about? That's the first thing. The second thing that has prompted my thoughts along these lines is the problem that is so painfully apparent in the scriptural book that we have been reading as our epistle lesson throughout this Easter season, that being the book of 1 John. It is one of the shorter books of the New Testament, but it is nonetheless one of the most important. And there is no book in the entire Bible where the word "we" plays such a big role. In fact, just in our short reading this morning from 1 John 3, just 9 verses, the words "we," "us," and "ours" occur over 20 times. And it's very clear here that the problem that's causing so much trouble in that community of believers, so much trouble that it is threatening even to tear the community apart, all comes down to just exactly who "we" is. And who then has the right to speak for us? As I mentioned in my sermon last week, the writer of this book, a man identified only as the elder, blames all the trouble in the community on outsiders, on outside preachers who have painted a picture of Jesus which simply doesn't correspond with the man that the elder and other older members of the community had actually known, or at least had heard about firsthand from the so-called beloved disciple, the founder of their community, of their church. And I don't doubt but that was a big part of the problem, those outsiders. But the more I read, the more I suspect it wasn't the whole problem, and maybe not even the biggest problem. As I read 1 John, and particularly as I read it alongside my reading in the Constitution during these past few weeks, the more I've begun to sense that the problem here, as the problem so often is in church disputes, it's a problem between generations. The problem of an older generation thinking that by virtue of its long years of experience, that it has the authority to speak on behalf of the entire community. That is to say, it is the one who should speak for the "we." While at the same time, a younger generation has come up and has begun to think for itself and believes that it has a right to be a voice at the table as well, to be one of the voices that makes up that "we." So the real problem here in 1 John, as the real problem is so often, may not be just who's right and who's wrong, as much as it is simply who's "we." Who is "we"? And who has the right to speak for "we"? Which brings me then to the final reason that I've been thinking about all this question, who is "we"? And that is the fact that this congregation is on the verge, and I mean the verge, of extending a call to someone to be the next pastor of this historic church. And I am absolutely confident that the pastor nominating committee is going to choose an extremely qualified person, and that that person is going to be an excellent leader for this congregation and do a great job as your pastor. This is a great time to be a member of First Church. And when your new pastor arrives in the not too distant future, very naturally you're going to want to welcome him or her to this congregation, and you're going to want to share your history in this church with them, to share your sense of this church's place in this community, your vision for its future, which you certainly should do. But when you do it, I want you to be very careful with how you use that little word. That little word, we. Because we all think that we speak for everyone else in this church, everyone else in this community, everyone else even in this nation. And the simple fact of the matter is, we don't. Our we is not everyone else's we, not even here. It just isn't. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just life. But that is why, in the end, what makes us a church is not who we are, or what we do, or what we believe even, as much as it is who He is, what He does, and what He believes. That He, of course, being Jesus Christ, and He alone. He's the He that makes us a we.